Okay, so this works just with a green thingy, right? Great, thank you very much for asking me to come and contribute to this session today. So I'm going to try to give you a bit of a perspective from the UK, but really from the perspective of a number of infrastructure projects that I'm involved in. So I'm no expert in data privacy. I'm probably the least expert on the panel today, but I suppose I have some experience and some responsibility on a number of levels for the sorts of things that we are talking about. I thought I might start actually, before I launch into my slides, with a perspective on GDPR from the UK perspective. So we had a data protection law that preceded GDPR. GDPR came in within the last 12 months, and all of those of us who have information governance in some way in their responsibilities took note, had to understand it and understand the context in which we needed, whether there were things that we needed to change. But I wanted to give the message that those of us who are involved in IRB-led studies that involve collecting consent from participants, we're already really good at this stuff. GDPR was brought in for companies who are not very good at protecting our rights and our data and play fast and loose with our data. We as scientists have actually always been doing this. And so GDPR does actually give us a really useful framework and the legal basis for which we are operating. And as Kristen said, there is very clear legal basis for both the identified and de-identified data being processed in a research context. So although I see GDPR as a useful framework that actually tells us all the things we were already doing. So we're already, as scientists, pretty good at this stuff. That doesn't mean that there aren't bad practices around, but just a sort of a reminder that this isn't something to be afraid of, to increase our fear level. So my slides are coming out slightly odd, but what I thought I would do today is so we just had a fantastic example of thinking about data governance from an institutional perspective from Bill. And so here's some examples of thinking about data governance from the perspective of, from different lenses, through different lenses. So first of all, you might be interested in protecting data or thinking about data sharing from an individual study perspective. And of course, these come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But I'm going to use as an example the UK Biobank. It's the biggest single study probably in the world, 500,000 individuals. It has a single IRB and consent process. It has, in this case, it's a single institution, but obviously an individual study could have multiple institutions. And so we'll go through that in a bit more detail. I'm then going to think about it from the perspective of an individual facility. So this within an institution, but many different sorts of studies, from large and small, and from more sensitive and less sensitive, etc. So in this case, multiple principal investigators, multiple funders, multiple ethics arrangements, etc. But a single institution. And then I'm going to lead on to thinking about the issues of privacy in the context of developing infrastructure for a field or a subfield. So I built some of the infrastructure for the Dementias Platform UK, where you have multiple study types, multiple IRBs, multiple consents, multiple PIs, etc. But this time we're sort of aligning ourselves around an individual disease area. So a few different perspectives to think about to add to the ones we've already heard. So just to tell you a bit about the UK Biobank, 500,000 individuals. It was open by design, so people consented to having their data shared right from day one. 100,000 individuals are currently being imaged, so we're up to 40,000 or 45,000 people who've been imaged. All sorts of data ranging from more sensitive to less sensitive, so including sort of prison information, mental health information, etc. at the top end, and then all of the sort of genetics, blood samples, etc. So some pretty sensitive information in there. Data access is governed through a data access committee. There's an administration fee to pay, and it's a two-stage process. There is a distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive data. And one of the key things that was baked into the UK Biobank right from the beginning was that no disclosure of any health information, I know I'm not allowed to talk about this today, it was allowed to go back to the individuals, but that's important because that means that re-identification of individuals to potentially take part in future studies and trials is limited, or at least you have to bear that in mind, the non-disclosure, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So a single facility, my facility is the Wellcome Centre for Integrative Neuroimaging. So now I'm thinking about the Wellcome Trust as a funder, very, very keen on open science. And so open science was baked into our centre status. These studies come in all shapes and sizes, some basic, some clinical, some commercial, all sorts of imaging data plus behavioural, etc. Some of it sensitive, a lot of it not particularly sensitive. And we're building infrastructure in this case to develop, to facilitate data sharing. So this is to help people who want to share their data do so more easily. And of course, all of the questions that we get are about governance and privacy. And what if my participants consented to this and that, but not this and that? And so governance becomes what you spend most of your time talking about, the technical challenges being more easily overcome. But the basic tenet here is that the responsibility for privacy and everything else to do with data sharing remains with the individual PI. So as a facility, you're creating infrastructure to enable PIs to share data, but that responsibility remains with that PI at all times. And that's also the same model with the platform that's now UK-wide and focused on dementia research. In this case, you have 35 cohorts, more than 3 million participants that come from cohorts that all have their own very thoroughly thought through governance structures and data access structures. And the platform infrastructure is to enable data sharing and data aggregation and cross-cohort analyses. In this case, it's all being done by HDR UK, Health Data Research UK. There's, at this point, no discussions being had, as far as I'm aware, about putting this out onto the Amazon or Google clouds. There's still a lot of nervousness about doing that in this particular set of infrastructure. The infrastructure enables a single point of entry for requesting access, but the data access still goes to the individual data access committees of the cohorts concerned. So the infrastructure that's being built is in many ways sort of emulating what might be possible on the cloud in this case, but at this point keeping it behind the doors of the sort of safe harbour of HDR UK and not going beyond that. So I put this up as an example of the sorts of things that we're afraid of. So here's an example of a paper that came out relatively recently describing how easy it is to re-identify people from what looks like de-identified data. And the scare stories here are that nearly 100% of people would be correctly re-identified using just 15 demographic attributes. And the results suggest that even heavily sampled anonymized data sets are unlikely to satisfy modern standards for anonymization set forth by GDPR, etc. So it's, the scare stories are easy to...
Can you just clarify what you mean by re-identify in this context? What does that mean to re-identify them?
It means to be able to know who the individual is.
So they could find the individual's name, right? Not just that this is a unique
Actually,
person.
I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. I think
it's an important distinction to make.
I interpreted it as meaning that they would be able to tell who.
They would be able to tell the particular individual, not that it was an individual.
That it was an
But they could
the actual
actually
name of the person.
triangulate to demographic information that identified the particular
Like
person.
that this is John Smith who lives at 34 John Smith Street. Okay.
Yeah. So, and there are other examples of this. I just put this one up as a recent example of the sorts of things that we need to be worried about as a community. But I also just wanted to remind us to be very mindful of the perspective of the participants that are in these cohorts and studies. Of course, they expect us to look after their privacy, and of course, they expect us to keep their data secure. But we also need to just think about what are some of the things that they expect us to do with it. So informed consent is the basis on which we do many of the things that we do. But informed is only the words that you thought of at the time that you wrote the consent form that they signed on that one occasion when they actually came into your laboratory. There are many things that you may not have thought of at the time you wrote the consent form that the participant would be more than happy for you to do with those data. And then there are, of course, many things that they would expect you not to do with those data. I heard a fantastic example of this when individual investigators use a consent as an excuse not to share the data. My participants did not consent to data sharing, therefore I'm not going to share this data set with the world. Well, neither did that participant consent to the use of those data to further the career of that one individual PI and not for science as a whole, you know. So what is implied in consent is a really tricky area, and here I would defer to my ethicist and social science colleagues to help us with the interpretation of this. The strict letter of what exactly the person signed to is not the whole of what that person thought they were or were not consenting to. So I think that's a really important perspective. And then, again, back to this issue of re-identification. So if you've taken part in a cohort study, you might have been part of this cohort study for 30 years. You might have given tons of your time and energy, and you're a very proud member of a particular cohort over many years. But if that cohort set up the governance such that you are not allowed to be re-identified, or you're not allowed to, nothing is allowed to be disclosed to you, then that might actually remove your opportunity to take part in the trial for the Alzheimer's drug that's around the corner. That would be, why would you not have the opportunity to do that? Like, you're the one that's given all of your time and energy so far. Why are you now being excluded from the opportunity to take part in these? So it's the point is that of course we need to worry about the security and privacy, but the perspective of the participants is really important, and every cohort has a participant panel, or certainly should have a participant panel that contributes to the data access perspective to inform that. So this is my last slide, and I suppose that I want to data privacy. It's hard. It's tempting to make that quite a negative and kind of rule-driven and an area full of worry and concern. And we could easily leave this room going, oh, I don't ever want to do anything in case I get it wrong. But of course, we're all here because we're interested in open science and interested in promoting the best cases of reuse of data. And so I thought I would leave us with some things that we need to think about in order to sell the benefits of open science on an equal basis with being careful about how we secure people's privacy. So of course there's a risk benefit. I think it's really easy for us to focus on the risks, but we're not necessarily, you know, as a group as good at promoting the benefits. And we heard about it earlier when somebody said, can we just come up with some examples, some case studies of where we've really made a positive benefit with open science that we couldn't have done otherwise. So, you know, collecting together some of those examples so that we are in a better position to judge the risk benefit rather than being just risk averse about it all, I think is an important thing to consider. Industry partnerships are a really important one. I told you that the UK is, well, certainly from the perspective of the things that I'm involved in, there's still a concern about entering into the sort of cloud-based future and a conservatism around that. And that's completely understandable, and it's all for good reasons. But actually, industry partners are important for everybody. And actually, when I wrote this line, what I was thinking was that when we think about informed consent for our participants in our studies, people are usually completely, in my experience, people are usually completely happy to share their data for research, for medical research to further the good of humanity. But they do take a step back and look worried if you talk about commercial partnerships and sharing data with industry who make money, and that's dirty and wrong and bad. And so, again, there's a kind of messaging around that and a public relations exercise, which is important for us to get right. We are, of course, afraid of the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. I still don't really know what is so very terrible about being re-identified, but I'm sure we can come up between us in the room. We can come up with some frightening examples of that. But you know, that sort of tendency to err on the side of risk aversion, I think, is the message that you've heard me give now. So and then finally, back to the power to the participants, who it's their data, and their voice needs to be loud and clear in terms of what we do with it. Thanks very much.